This here is a mid-2009 MacBook. Not a MacBook Air or MacBook Pro, a MacBook. And you may notice it has a polycarbonate or plastic outer casing. It's one of the last to have this design, as in 2011 Apple moved away from this, preferring other materials such as aluminum or titanium. So, it's not exactly the newest machine on the block, but how usable is it 15 years later? Just by looking at this MacBook you can tell it's outdated, with the thick bezels, square eyesight camera, the amount of ports on the side, and how thick it is. The battery on the bottom of the device is removable and easily replaceable just by putting a coin or screw in and twisting it out. There's a CD reader on the other side, which was still pretty important to most back then, as the way to install software was still through a CD in plenty of cases. The keyboard is pretty good too, feeling clicky and nice to type on. I'm actually typing up this part of the script on that MacBook, and it's doing the job just fine. It isn't backlit. The final revision of the plastic MacBook did have a backlit keyboard, so unfortunately this misses out by a few months. It isn't a big deal, but can be annoying for anyone working at night or in dark areas. The screen could help to light up the keyboard, but that drains the battery quicker and still doesn't allow for much visibility, so a keyboard backlight was a nice addition. Back to that screen, what's it like? The screen is 13.3 inches diagonally, which is fairly standard even now. With a resolution of 1280 by 800, it's roughly 113 pixels per inch, which looks alright today, but it's not amazing. It's considered high definition but non-standard. It was pretty good for the time, and unless you're using a much nicer screen, you won't find much issue using it today. It does support one external display at a maximum of 920 by 1200 resolution, which is standard full high definition. Now, let's look at what's behind this screen. The MacBook is powered by an Intel Core 2 Duo running at 2.1 GHz. 2GB of DDR2 RAM, which to my knowledge can be self-upgraded to 4GB officially and 6GB unofficially. It came with an 160GB hard drive as base, and for graphics it has an Nvidia GeForce 9400M with 256MB of VRAM, which may seem old by today's standards, but was more than enough for most people back in 2009. It's enough for this machine, as the screen wasn't demanding enough to use all the VRAM, and 2GB of DDR2 RAM was enough for most people. Plus, back then the RAM and storage were upgradable after purchase. Remember, this was a MacBook that was mainly for students or light to medium daily use, taking notes, viewing photos and videos, sending emails, work meetings, that kind of thing. It served that purpose well, being only slightly slower than the base MacBook Pro, but for $300 less US dollars. There were other trade-offs, like a lower maximum RAM, 4GB versus 8GB, the plastic case, and other design downgrades, but those are the things the buyer of this MacBook aren't going to really worry about. It does the job and it does it well, and as I said, even today I'm able to type up a document and run a couple Chrome tabs without much issue. There's a reason the polycarbonate MacBook was the best-selling Mac in Apple's history during its production, and for 5 months was the best-selling laptop out of any brand in US retail stores. The thing that will stick out to most people nowadays is how heavy and thick it may be compared to other laptops they've used, but it was pretty standard for 2009. If you wanted a thinner and lighter MacBook, you'd be wanting the MacBook Air, which at the time was known as the world's thinnest notebook. But at the time, the MacBook Air was more expensive than the MacBook Pro, with worse performance. This would change in 2010, and ever since the MacBook Air has been Apple's most affordable and popular laptop, but back in 2009, it made the MacBook a no-brainer for most people, as it had everything they would need in a laptop for a great price, and could do almost anything the Pros could do. But that was 15 years ago. What can it do now? The latest official operating system available for the mid-2009 MacBook is OS X El Capitan, which was released in 2015. It's lost support in some categories by now, with some pages in Safari and Chrome simply not loading, but the basics like Google Docs still work. They're not free of bugs, but will get the job done. YouTube still loads and plays videos just fine, but I wouldn't recommend trying to view anything in higher than 720p. Because then the MacBook really starts to show its age, and the video becomes very choppy. Older games like Minecraft run okay, but recent versions don't work. Here is version 1.8 running at about 20 to 30 frames per second with low render distance. It's playable, but not practical. It lags and has performance drops frequently. This is more just to show what it technically can do, rather than a show of what it should do. Something else it can do, but really shouldn't, is be upgraded to the latest macOS using OpenCore Legacy Patcher. Here it is running macOS Sonoma. It's slow and buggy, but it's running. Not a whole lot works here, but modern versions of Safari websites have a better chance of loading. Some apps will launch, but if you try and launch something demanding, it can cause the whole thing to go unresponsive. I don't recommend doing this, especially without the RAM upgrade. Not only isn't it practical, but pretty much impossible without an external keyboard, mouse, and USB 2.0 hub, as during the setup the laptop will stop recognizing its built-in keyboard and mouse, so while it can be updated, it's definitely more just something to do for fun, rather than making it any more of a practical laptop. Although a higher end model with extra RAM and a faster CPU might be able to hold its own better, proceed at your own risk. Although apps and websites have trouble being used now, as I mentioned before, back in the day this would handle whatever you threw at it. Students loved it, and it was considered a great deal for its price point. The 5 hours of battery on the 2009 model was decent enough for the time, and a half-hour upgrade from the 4.5 hours on the previous model. It would handle most use cases well enough, even some video editing. Probably not as much anymore, as video quality has gotten better, file sizes are larger and video editing apps themselves take more to run than they would have 15 years ago. Combine that with an old battery and dusty, worn-out thermals, there'll be a struggle. But it would be enough for 2009, as long as you weren't pushing it too hard. It served its purpose well back then, but its purpose wasn't always just working on documents and the likes, but also as a digital hub for your files and media. Back then, iCloud was still a couple years away from existing, and even afterwards a common place to store your music, photos, videos, files, contacts and more was on your computer. It's how you had to set up an iPhone until 2010, and how iPods sync music and such too. It could be done with a desktop or an external hard drive, but it wouldn't be uncommon for a MacBook such as this one to serve as a digital hub for someone's media. It came with 160GB of storage as base, which should be enough for the time, but it definitely struggles now, especially in speed since it's a hard drive and not an SSD. Luckily, it's easy enough to upgrade the storage in these. This model here actually has an SSD instead of a hard drive. It seems that somebody cared for this laptop quite a lot back in its day, as when I got my hands on it, it was in great condition. The battery holds a charge, it was clear of any major damage, looked pretty clean, and came with its own charger and computer bag. The SSD really helps keep it fast and usable. Apps open much faster, and even when pushed further through OpenCore Legacy Patcher, the SSD is what keeps it from completely frying. This here is a MacBook Pro of the same year. It has a nicer screen, an aluminum unibody, faster CPU, and faster RAM, with a higher max capacity, along with a few other differences here and there. But it still has its original hard drive, and just look at the difference. It's clear that an SSD is very beneficial if you want to be using one of these, or even just want to mess around with one today. The speed difference is very impressive, and can lead to a computer being more responsive overall. Initially I upgraded both of these to Big Sur, and the plastic MacBook with the SSD handled it okay, so I continued and upgraded to Sonoma, whereas its more powerful counterpart with the hard drive is barely running on Big Sur, taking minutes to fully load, and when it does, it takes a while to register clicks, and turns opening an app into a situation where it's best to get up, grab a drink of water, sit back down and hope it's finished loading. Luckily, it's very easy to put an SSD in an old MacBook, especially the aluminum ones like this. I won't show that here, but if you're interested, I'd recommend having a look online. It's surprisingly quick, and you'll find plenty of short tutorials that show each step perfectly. With one of these, a new life can be brought to these machines and can be fun to mess around with on old macOS, or even newer macOS if you're brave enough. Go wild, it can be a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, the 2009 polycarbonate MacBook's days of being a proper tool is over. It can be useful for an old macOS experience, but really El Capitan isn't ancient. It was a great deal back in the day, earning a spot among the best-selling laptops of its time. The purpose it served as an entry-level MacBook for schoolwork and such was taken over by the MacBook Air not long after its release, but it is remembered fondly as a charming, not-so-little laptop that was durable, reliable, and upgradable. It's aged well all things considered, especially if yours has an SSD. It turned into a fun tool to experiment and mess with, and this does give it somewhat a second life, one which can be lived in various ways depending on who owned it in its previous life, and whose hands it's in now. For many, that may be the same owner, and if that's you, have fun with it. Anyway, that's about it for now. I'll hopefully see you again soon, so thanks for watching. See ya!